You're all very, very welcome to the Sheldonian this afternoon, evening, and a very special welcome to our speaker this evening, Reni Eddo-Lodge, who I will introduce in a moment. My name is Elika Burma, and I am the Professor of World Literature and English in the English faculty, and I'm one of the organizers of the event this evening. This conversation between Reni Eddo-Lodge and Rebecca Surender is a special post-colonial seminar. The post-colonial seminar is based in the English faculty, and it links together the John Fell-funded Writers Make Worlds project and the Mellon-funded Humanities and Identities project at Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. And I'm the principal investigator of both projects, so that's why I'm introducing this evening. In Writers Make Worlds, we are concerned with widening the syllabus in English to include more Black British and British Asian writers, which we believe those writers will only become more known about where we model diversity in our curriculums and so widen the conversation as to what counts as literature in English. Do please go to the Writers Make Worlds website. There's masses of information there, and our site is very, very busy. It's constantly being added to. With Humanities and Identities, the Torch program, we are talking about diversity and race representation within the university and wider society, and we are widening our subject areas, we're talking about this, to include attention to race, representation, identity, and the global South. Reni Eddo-Lodge's work resonates very powerfully with this, as you will all know as you've come here this evening. Reni Eddo-Lodge is a London-based, award-winning journalist. She has written for any number of publications, the New York Times, The Voice, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and many others. She is the winner of a Woman of the World Bold Moves Award, and she was chosen as one of the top 30 young people in digital media by The Guardian in 2014. She has also been listed as amongst ELLE's 100 inspirational women and the Roots 30 Black Viral Voices under 30. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is her first book. It won the 2018 British Book Awards in the Non-Fiction Narrative Book of the Year category. It also won the 2018 Jhalak Prize and was chosen as the Foyle's Non-Fiction Book of the Year and Blackwell's Non-Fiction Book of the Year. It was shortlisted also for the Books Are My Bag Readers Award for non-fiction. Professor Rebecca Surender, who will be in conversation with Reni Eddo-Lodge this evening, was appointed Pro-Vice-Chancellor and University Advocate for Equality and Diversity in January 2015. The role provides leadership and coordination of equality and diversity across the university in order to advance the institution's commitment to fostering an inclusive culture. Professor Surender is also a member of the Department for Social Policy and Intervention and a Fellow of Green Templeton College. She has worked as a consultant and advisor for various multilateral and government agencies, including the World Bank, and she is currently a visiting professor at the Institute of Social and Economic Research, ISA, at Rhodes University, South Africa. So I'm going to welcome Reni Eddo-Lodge now, as it were, ceremoniously to the podium to read two extracts from her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and then we will kick off with the discussion. Reni, you're very, very welcome. Please join me in welcoming her again.
Thank you, Elika, and thanks to everyone for opting to spend this sunny evening with me. I know that if I had the option to be inside or outside right now, I'd be outside, so just say, make sure you soak up some vitamin D at some point today. Okay, so I'm going to read you two extracts from my book. The first being the blog post that I wrote 4.5 years ago now, which inspired what became this. And then I'm going to read an extract that is very Oxford-based, a very local extract. Okay, so this was a blog post that became the book. I'm no longer engaging with white people on the topic of race. Not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I can no longer engage with the gulf of an emotional disconnect that white people display when a person of colour articulates their experience. You can see their eyes shut down and harden. It's like treacle is poured into their ears, blocking up their ear canals. It's like they can no longer hear us. This emotional disconnect is the conclusion of living a life oblivious to the fact that their skin colour is the norm and all others deviate from it. At best, white people have been taught not to mention that people of colour are different in case it offends us. They truly believe that the experiences of their life as a result of their skin colour can and should be universal. I just can't engage with the bewilderment and the defensiveness as they try to grapple with the fact that not everyone experiences the world in the way that they do. They've never had to think about what it means in power terms to be white. So anytime they're vaguely reminded of this front, they interpret it, of this fact. I've read this too many times. They interpret it as an affront. Their eyes glaze over in boredom or widen in indignation. Their mouths start twitching as they get defensive. Their throats open up as they try to interrupt, itching to talk over you, but not really listen because they need to let you know that you've got it wrong. The journey towards understanding structural racism still requires people of colour to prioritise white feelings. Even if they can hear you, they're not really listening. It's like something happens to the words as they leave our mouths and reach their ears. The words hit a barrier of denial and they don't get any further. That's the emotional disconnect. It's not really surprising because they've never known what it means to embrace a person of colour as a true equal with thoughts and feelings that are as valid as their own. Watching The Colour of Fear by Lee Man-wha, I saw people of colour break down in tears as they struggled to convince a defiant white man that his words are enforcing and perpetuating a white racist standard on them. All the while he stared obliviously, completely confused by this pain, at best trivialising it, at worst ridiculing it. I've written before about this white denial being the ubiquitous politics of race that operates on its inherent invisibility. So I can't talk to white people about race anymore because of the consequent denials, awkward cartwheels, and mental acrobatics that they display when this is brought to their attention. Who really wants to be alerted to a structural system that benefits them at the expense of others? I can no longer have this conversation because we're often coming at it from completely different places. I can't have a conversation with them about the details of a problem if they don't even recognise that the problem exists. Worse still is the white person who might be willing to entertain the possibility of said racism, but who thinks we enter this conversation as equals. We don't. Not to mention that entering into conversation with defiant white people is frankly a dangerous task for me. As the heckles rise and the defiance grows, I have to tread incredibly carefully because if I express frustration, anger, or exasperation at their refusal to understand, they will tap into their pre-subscribed racist tropes about angry black people who are a threat to them and their safety. It's very likely that they'll then paint me as a bully or an abuser. It's also likely that their white friends will rally round them, rewrite history, and make the lies the truth. Trying to engage with them and navigate their racism is not worth that. Amid every conversation about nice white people feeling silenced by conversations about race, there's a sort of ironic and glaring lack of understanding or empathy for those of us who have been visibly marked out as different for our entire lives and live the consequences. It's truly a lifetime of self-censorship that people of colour have to live. The options are speak your truth and face a reprisal, or bite your tongue and get ahead in life. It must be a strange life, always having permission to speak and feeling indignant when you're finally asked to listen. It stems from white people's never questioned entitlement, I suppose. I cannot continue to emotionally exhaust myself trying to get this message across while also towing a very precarious line that tries not to implicate any one white person in their role of perpetuating structural racism, lest they character assassinate me. So I'm no longer talking to white people about race. I don't have a huge amount of power to change the way the world works, but I can set boundaries. I can halt the entitlement they feel towards me, and I'll start that by stopping the conversation. The balance is too far swung in their favor. Their intent is often not to listen or learn, but to exert their power, to prove me wrong, to emotionally drain me, and to rebalance the status quo. I'm not talking to white people about race unless I absolutely have to. If there's something like a media or conference appearance that means that someone might hear what I'm saying and feel less alone, then I'll participate. But I'm no longer dealing with people who don't want to hear it, wish to ridicule it, and frankly, don't deserve it. So that's extract one. Oh, thank you. Okay, this next extract is from a chapter called Fear of a Black Planet. Late 2015 saw the rise of a British Rhodes Must Fall movement. Inspired by similar protests from students in South Africa's University of Cape Town, students at Oxford University set their sights on removing a statue of colonial businessman Cecil Rhodes on their university campus. As well as founding mining company De Beers Consolidated Mines, eventually Diamond Purveyors De Beers, Cecil Rhodes played a key part in expanding the British Empire in South Africa, based on the belief that the British were the finest race in the world, direct quote. His colonial project displaced Africans from their land. The country we now know as Zimbabwe was once named Rhodesia after Rhodes. The country's citizens attempted to resist British rule and paid with their lives. For many, Rhodes was the father of South African apartheid. When he lived in Britain, he attended Oxford's Oriel College, and a statue of him still stands there today. It was in 2015 that students studying at the university let it be known loud and clear that they wanted that statue gone. A national debate about whether the statue should fall ensued. The black student protesters were accused of being undemocratic. Cecil Rhodes was a racist, read one headline, but you can't readily expunge him from history. That was a strange conclusion to draw because campaigning to take down a statue is not the same as Tipexing Cecil Rhodes' name out of the history books. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign was not calling for Rhodes to be erased from history. Instead, they were questioning whether or not he should be so overtly celebrated. The campaign's opponents, who included Lord Patten, the Chancellor of Oxford University, said that by exercising their democratic right to protest, the students were actually impinging on freedom of speech by making a fuss, disrupting the everyday, and pointing out the problem. They had become the problem. Somehow, it wasn't believable that Lord Patten simply wanted free and fair debate and a healthy exchange of ideas on his campus. It looked like he just wanted silence, the kind of strained peace that simmers with resentment, the kind that requires some to suffer so that others are comfortable. To insist that Rhodes Must Fall campaigners were restricting discussion was simply a lie. The work of the protest movement brought little-known aspects of Britain's colonial involvement in Africa to primetime news, exposing the facts to audiences who almost certainly wouldn't have learned about it on the national curriculum. What student protesters achieved was the opposite of shutting down debate. That the campaign was misrepresented revealed the passive-aggressive, anti-black sleight of hand that so many British conversations about race are guilty of indulging in. This freedom of speech fight can hardly even be called a debate. Instead, it is one-sided, with a powerful side constantly warping the terms of engagement. Couching opposition to anti-racist speech and protest as a noble fight for freedom of speech is about protecting white people from being criticised. It seems that there is a belief among some white people that being accused of racism is far worse than actual racism. If Rhodes Must Fall's detractors really believed in freedom of speech, then they would have let the debate happen without throwing around disingenuous accusations that black people were stopping them from speaking freely. They would have engaged with the ideas being put forward rather than using intellectually dishonest tricks designed to circumvent taking the protesters seriously. I think that there is a fear among many white people that accepting Britain's difficult history with race means somehow admitting defeat. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Sorry for trashing your boss.
I've got a feeling we will return to the subject of Rhodes Must Fall at some point in today's conversation. Thank you for making time for being with us, and I hope you can get a sense from the size of the audience here and from the fact that the organisers had to keep moving venues until they found one big enough to hold this event, just how excited the Oxford community is that you're here tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for reading to begin, and it was wonderful to hear you reading directly from reading your own words, and to get a sense of the catalyst and the idea behind the book. I wonder if you could just begin by telling us whether the book has had the intended effect you anticipated or desired, and what kind of impact it's had on you.
Well, the impact, I didn't really think much about what I wanted the book to do other than attempt to have some role in changing Britain's conversation about racism in particular. And I think it's done that. I think that the book, alongside many other cultural zeitgeisty things that were happening at the same time, has done that. I feel it sort of stands on its own. It's a piece of work that people use almost as their own, and I can pick up a copy that somebody else has written notes in, and it's very much their copy, and the interpretation can sometimes be wildly different than what I intended, and that is something that none of that I anticipated. I just wanted to, I guess, affirm some people's perspective and also change other people's minds. That was really my goal. I just wanted to attempt to intervene in some way, which is why the book is very current affairs-y. It's very like recent history-ish. I wanted to essentially just provide an analysis that I felt wasn't out there. And I feel that it's done that, so I'm really pleased.
Great. Are you surprised at its success, if I can put it like that?
I don't really know. I feel like when a book sort of becomes successful, it's like, as the author, it runs away from you, basically. So, of course, yes, I wrote it, but as more people have taken it up and more people are reading it, it's very much my reader's book, So sometimes I feel a little like, I'm just proud of what the book's doing, and I hope it keeps running, Surprised, I didn't have any expectations. It's my first book. I didn't know, once it came out on publication day, which was over a year ago, I was just like, okay, that's it. I've done what I wanted to do. And I didn't really think about it past publication day. So the fact that new people are embracing it every day is a bit mind-blowing to me. I try not to dwell on it too much.
Hard to imagine, given the audience here and the response in the wider country, that most people aren't familiar with what's in this book. But if you were to stumble upon somebody who didn't know about the book, how would you characterize or summarize its key argument or arguments?
I would just say, well, it depends who's picking it up, really. It really depends. I imagine I would say, this is a book that's going to make you think differently about what you think racism is. It's as simple as that.
Say more.
That's the elevator pitch. That's what I wanted to do with the book. It's going to make you think differently about racism. It may change your mind. It may make you think harder about what you already think about racism. It might make you look at the culture you're consuming in a different way. I had somebody message me recently saying, I'm struggling to watch TV now after reading your book. That was not an intended impact. So it was really just to get people thinking critically about some really unquestioned narratives that we are being told about race and racism in the country. That was it. I just wanted people to think critically. And, you know, those extracts that I read out, they're very much my opinion, but I tried to balance it with some reporting. And I think with the reporting, I don't want to shove my opinion down people's throats. I've always wanted to just pull back and let people make what they wanted out of the facts provided.
So to paraphrase a little bit, it's an exploration, engagement with race relations in a broad way. It struck me that you didn't attempt to develop a theory of racism. You didn't engage with this is why it exists. Talk throughout the chapters about terms like structural racism, institutional racism, the system, and I think one chapter is called "It's the System." Does that mean that you do have a view that actually that you have a materialist analysis of racism, that racism is caused because it is economically or materially beneficial to certain people, rather than, for instance, a kind of biological or psychological set of explanations about why racism exists?
Yes, I'm not really from the Richard Dawkins school of thought, which is like, oh yeah, tribalism is just human nature. I think that it's absolutely made by society and can be deconstructed by society. And so because I'm not of that school of thought, I'm not interested in that set of navel-gazing about, oh, well, maybe people who are being racist are just bad people. Like, can we find the ways in which they're being bad? Or, you know, you see, sadly, sociologists sort of like take part in that sort of narrative a lot. I'm interested less of the intent and more the impact. I'm interested in how this affects people's lives. And I'm interested in the ways in which, you know, there's a whole chapter, the race and class chapter, that looks at the way that a specific housing policy and a housing policy direction marginalizes black people in that borough because they're not thinking about their needs or interests. And frankly, at this point, I'm not interested in twisting myself up about, oh, well, why aren't they thinking? As a journalist, I will happily ask the people who are implementing that policy, well, did you realize that it was going to hit people of color in the borough in this, and this way? And can you know, I'm interested in holding them accountable, but I'm not so interested in examining their souls. I'm interested in the, like, material ways that it's impacting people's life chances. And, you know, I argue in the book, this isn't necessarily about good people or bad people. You know, much like how we would understand patriarchy, it's essentially, it's a system of power that is working in the favor of the people who benefit from it at this moment in time. And it's just really clear to see if you're not directly benefiting from it. So I'm very interested in the impact. And also, you know, I talk about whiteness, capital W, or structural racism, but really I'm looking at whiteness, capital W, as a power structure in the same way that we would look at patriarchy. I don't know, I guess like the background in journalism just means that I'm just interested in how it's affecting people's actual lives at this moment in time. And I feel like we're in a cultural moment now where people are very interested in tying themselves into knots about, oh, well, why do people think this? And I'm just interested in how it's affecting people's lives right now. And I fear that well, why do people think this? Or because in my analysis, I'm seeing more subtle and covert marginalization than overt hatred. Tells me that it's just not as simple as people who mean harm on others, you know. But what's been interesting, I think, with the response of the book is that some people have interpreted what I'm saying in that way. But I think I've been as clear as I can in the book, so I can't take responsibility for that.
Let me push you a little bit on it, because I'm a boring sociologist and social scientist. Some might argue that actually having a kind of analysis of what is the determinants here, what's driving this, is important in order to think about what the appropriate responses are. And you use the term patriarchy as a explanation that feminists have for female subjugation. But my generation, and I'm older than you are, my generation, there was a real debate about, was the oppression of women to do with materialist explanations, that let's just say it suited the economic system of the time, capitalism, to have women as a reserve army of labor or as doing unpaid work to reproduce the next bit of the workforce, to theories of patriarchy, which located the causes of female subjugation in a different place. And those different theories had different consequences for how groups of women engaged with men or, tried to change the system. Are there analogies or...
So you pointed out that there was a materialist. So what would analysis of, I'm familiar with that.
Yes,
so in terms of like the locating it in patriarchy, because I suppose I see those as one of the same. What is the difference in terms of locating it in patriarchy?
That changing capitalism, let's say, this is a very 1970s set of discussions already, but changing the economic system won't automatically liberate women, even if those with power in capitalism have a vested interest in gender relations, let's say. That if we transform and we have just a different mode of production, it won't change the underlying dynamic.
Oh, it's so difficult to tell, isn't it? It's like a nature v nurture debate.
Well, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. I can certainly see, the sort of like cut and dry patriarchy serving economic interests. That's quite obvious. I don't know if I can make a clear parallel when it comes to race relations. I'm not sure if I can. Maybe it's just something I haven't thought about that much, Rebecca. I don't want to...
Yeah, no.
I don't want to speak on something that... I was quite inspired while writing the book about from the work of Theodore W. Allen, who was a white Marxist working in Brooklyn in the 20th century, who was very inspired by the civil rights movement, and he wrote an essay as an independent scholar in which he sort of said that, when it comes to labor rights, the white worker has an interest in the subjugation of the black worker, and the white worker recognizes that subjugation gives the white worker benefits, which is why solidarity is not going to be fostered in that circumstance unless white workers divest from racism. And I guess if that's materialist, call me a materialist. It definitely comes from the left of the political spectrum. Well, I think one thing that's been interesting for me for this book is really seeing how these analyses of like structural racism and justice are coming from all across the political spectrum, which is really interesting. But I do think that vested interest has a lot to do with people's social and economic status currently, and particularly socially, a feeling of losing if you and of admitting defeat, and this feeling like there's a zero-sum game. There are not enough resources for all. There's not enough space for everyone to thrive or survive. There's not enough money for everyone to earn. Or, at least that's what I'm seeing in our more recent political discourse.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a slightly related but slightly different question, which is about the nature of white racism. Do you think that there's something qualitatively different about white racism than any racism between people? And I understand you distinguish between prejudice and racism, but I am talking about racism now, and I can just explain a little bit. So because of the history of slavery, because of colonialism, and because of the power of European and North American society, is the racism that this book is talking about different to any group of people who hold power over another? So I'm from India, thinking about Hindu nationalist violence and racism towards other minorities, Muslims, Christians, depending on where you are in India. Japanese racism towards Chinese or Korean people, or racism of certain Middle Eastern countries towards South Asian immigrant workers. Is there something different about white racism in your view, or is it?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I can only speak with expertise about Britain.
Yeah.
I can't claim to be an expert on some of those things that you mentioned, but it seems to me that in this country, because of European colonialism and British colonialism, there was an accumulation of wealth and resources, and racism was a part of that. And it advanced an ideology around the world of white superiority as part of that colonialism. And so, to go back and touch on your last question a little bit, it is about that accumulation of economic power that's absolutely, I think, key in this conversation. If we want to look at it in a big picture, sort of structural way, that we have to sort of recognize. But am I going to do a compare and contrast with other areas of the world? I'm not going to, because I don't know enough about what that kind of racism looks like. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Britain has had its fingers in many pies all around the world for many, many years, and has, I suppose, through its own advancement, always been quite cultural in that practice, and yet part of maintaining this ideology of white superiority is like vehemently denying that over and over again. And I interviewed an actor who works in both the US and America the other day, and he said, well, Britain's idea of itself, Britain's really multicultural, has been for a long time, but we think we're Downton Abbey or something. Yeah. And so, like, for me, it's just that weird denial of, like, what the reality is and what the idea of the country is. Maybe I'm diverging from your question, but yeah, that, like, accumulation of economic capital and power. We are living in a country that tried to take over the world at one point, is I think key to the conversation historically. What does that mean day to day? It means that, yes, prejudice between people based on race absolutely exists around the country, and it doesn't actually matter what race you are, but if you're a gatekeeper in this country, and that is somebody who rents places to people, or someone's boss, or in charge of someone's life chance in some way, you're just more likely to be white. And so the prejudice in the minds of a white gatekeeper has, like, real material effects on people and other people's life chances, which is why I concern myself with it. Yeah. And that's not to say that I don't think that the prejudice amongst communities of colour, some of whom are in gatekeeper positions, is not important. It's just that there's less in gatekeeper positions to affect people's life chances.
Yeah, thank you. I think some of the fetishizing of Downton Abbey has to be laid at the doors of some swathes of American society who want to continue to see Great Britain as Great Britain and feel disappointed when they come and the reality isn't. I'm married to an American, lived in America for many years. I'd like to move from the sort of broad, abstract discussions we've been having to just now talk a little bit about some of the themes that you raise yourself in the book. And one I'd like to particularly explore is this concept of white privilege. It's something that resonated with me hugely, and I'm sure any person of colour who reads about it. Not only that white people automatically, inevitably benefit from certain structural advantages, but actually that what I'm struck by and was struck by in reading your chapter is that they're completely free of the burden of even thinking about these issues, and that's quite a liberation. Actually, it's quite a benefit. Can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, the flip side of those material benefits I was just talking about is not even having to think about them, not having to think about what has been done in your name as a person who is white and British. And a lot of bad things have happened in the name of people who are both white and British, and yet it's not owned. Like, that's really troubling to me. When I was on touring the book and I'm a British person, you know, British through and through, and I'm always thoroughly reminded of that when I'm travelling for work. But when I was in Australia and New Zealand on book tour last year, I was absolutely flabbergasted, and maybe this is just my ignorance, right? But I was flabbergasted to know that Australia was discovered by a white Yorkshireman, and I was like, why is this not on the British curriculum? Like, why is there this like almost distancing of things that have been done in Britain's name? That was done in the name of this country, and it caused an awful lot of pain and devastation to people. And so I guess white privilege is not even having to concern oneself with that. I speak in the book about an incident between me and an old friend while I was at university. We both took a module on the transatlantic slave trade. I'm black British, my friend was white British, and they decided, I'm gonna just drop out of this because I just feel it's not relevant to me. And I was like, the luxury, you know, the luxury to just decide that none of that stuff has anything to do with you. Did she ask for it to be done in her name? No. Does that mean that one can just be like, nothing to do with me, disown herself from, I mean, it's part and parcel of the country that we're living in. And, you know, it's like, it reminds me of that extract that I just read out. You know, it's like, it is admitting that, it's discussing that, admitting defeat. I mean, the spoils have already been gained at this point, so why not just open up the conversation and have an honest conversation about it? But also, I talk about white privilege being the absence of not having your life chances affected negatively because of your race. And that's not to say that your life chances can't be affected negatively by other sort of like aspects of structural discrimination, class, gender, disability, sexuality. It's not to say that it still can't affect you because of those kind of latent prejudices going on in the minds of gatekeepers. But it's just less likely to happen because of your race. It's not having to do with that. And you know, I have this bit in the book where I talk about the life of a hypothetical black boy, and that's just data pulled from various different organizations and government agencies. And over again, I could see that like black people were on the back foot in these institutions that you expect to treat everybody equally. And I deduced from that if some people are on the back foot, then that must mean that others are getting a head start by the fact that their back foot exists in the first place. And that head start is white privilege. It's not chilling out and being fed grapes on a reclining chair. Although some people want to, when I say it, that's what they want to hear, lap of luxury life. No, absolutely not. I grew up amongst many poor people, many of whom were white. But it's the fact that affecting your life chances is just not going to happen because you are white in particular.
It's interesting that you've really concentrated on structural economic facts here. whereas critics, detractors from what you're saying, have said this is about a middle-class, self-indulgent sort of focus on identity politics somehow, get over it. You're very much talking about, bread and butter issues, housing, employment, education. So what do you say to people who say this is really now, we're kind of post-race, this is...
Well, I think they probably haven't read my work. I mean, I read their work. So I don't understand why they keep trying to reduce it down to interpersonal conflicts. It's so much more than that. And I've always been interested in the big picture. To some extent, I can understand the critiques. I personally am so tired about conversations to do with race and racism that are so hung up on identity that we're not zooming out to look at the larger issues of how these big structural discriminations are affecting people's day-to-day lives. I think it's difficult, though, because these issues are both deeply personal as well as massive big picture. And what I wanted to put the big picture in the book, it's why I didn't write a memoir. But, well, first, because my life isn't that interesting. But secondly, because the issue is so much more about me and my life. You'll get the odd anecdote here and there. But I wanted people to understand that what they were experiencing in their life was to do with a larger thing at play here, It's much bigger than what we're dealing with day to day, but it's also what we're dealing with day to day is part of that bigger picture. And so, my journalism background meant that I was always interested in looking at, okay, so like what are the cause and social dynamics and like policy changes and whatnot that have led to this particular situation, which is like it's a year anniversary of Grenfell Tower today, and it's weighing on my mind in particular. And I think that what Grenfell Tower did in the midst of that disgusting tragedy was a massive, huge, focusing in of a massive tragedy that basically showed a quiet, structural, unjust landscape that had existed for a very, very, very long time. And that had to happen in order for that landscape to be shown, which is awful. To me, the point of journalism is to always expose that quiet, low-level, injustice that's been going on for years, so long that people it's just normal. This is just how we live. Life is just hard. I had somebody tell me the other day, before I read your book, I thought life was just hard until I realized there was reasons for it. And that's what I want people to understand. I want people to feel equipped to hold accountable those institutions that are making decisions that are making people's lives hard. And I think that that's just so much more, that's so much bigger than me, and a conversation that is supplementary or perhaps the groundwork for conversations about identity and interpersonal situations. I must say, I'm not sure that these detractors are meaningfully engaging with any anti-racist work. I think they've just got a bit of a caricature in their head. It's always a bit annoying to me because I do pay attention and attempt to meaningfully engage with what they've got to say, but all I ever come away with is a total caricature of anti-racist work. So I guess they're just not reading it. I don't know. It's a shame. They profess to be smart, but I don't think they are.
It's been known. Thank you. One issue that you don't dwell on very much in the book, you talk a little bit about language, and I'll come back to that, but as somebody who, I came to Britain in 1966 as a young child and grew up through the 70s and 80s. And those of us who were politically active during that time, the end of the 70s, early 80s, in race politics in this country, very much defined ourselves, people of colour defined themselves as black. So there was black and white. We didn't have terms such as BME, and the heterogeneity within minority communities wasn't emphasised. Okay? And it wasn't about a descriptive skin colour, it was, as you say, a social construct. It was a political construct. My observation is that has changed somewhat, and first of all, is that a positive thing if that has changed, that we have terms such as black and minority ethnic and groups are differentiating themselves from each other? Is that a good thing because it shows communities are getting larger, they have enough self-confidence and self-identity? Or is it denoting a lack of solidarity and a fragmentation of black community?
I didn't touch on it in the book because I was more concerned with pinpointing and really zeroing in on whiteness as a power structure rather than determining who gets to be black or not, because I found that the analysis that the book is making seems to resonate with people who are not white, right? So an Asian American person will say, I really resonated with the book. And an Indigenous Australian person can say, I really resonated with the book. And a black British person can say, I really resonated with the book. So I wanted to be able to pinpoint that framework and give people the tools to do that. But it is a question. When I was coming up in activism, you know, when I was in university and stuff, I was organising with a group called Black Feminists, and it was a group of women of colour. And I never saw a problem with it at that time because I recognised and still do recognise the point of essentially black as a political position, and it's kind of internationalist solidarity, and I still have a lot of sympathy with that position. But I also recognise that today, you know, like my brother's 21, so I always think to myself, okay, so how am I going to explain the issues to somebody who was born in like 97? And he doesn't resonate with black meaning anybody but somebody who is my skin tone, right? And I think that the reasons why that's happened is for a number of reasons. I think one of them is just like local authorities and like organizations who were advocating on behalf of people of color had to like fill in funding forms that like broke up your race and ethnicity into this box or that box. There was that, right? But also I think that there's been a bit more of a pushback about the idea of political blackness because the institutions that were advancing and pushing for it have lost funding, with the exception of perhaps like trade unions. The sort of like institutions of remembrance in Britain of that activist time that you spoke of are fragmented at best, I would have to say. You know, it's something that I was busy researching when I was looking for the book, and if I hadn't been surrounded by people older than me in the union movement when I was like 19, 20, I wouldn't have understood it, I wouldn't have got it. There's also a more contemporary backlash against the term black in the political sense amongst people my brother's age, and they say things like, well, it doesn't account for, you know, basically racism, well, a particular kind of anti-black racism amongst lots of communities of colour, and that's true, it doesn't, but I think that black in the political sense solidarity is part of upending that kind of anti-black racism. In my experience, people who are not my skin colour, who call themselves black, are far more like schooled in what anti-blackness is than somebody who isn't my skin colour but isn't white, who doesn't call themselves black. Do you know what I mean? So this is a bit of a circular conversation, but but basically I recognise the importance and also the fact that black in the political sense harks to a kind of internationalist perspective that absolutely seeks to upend whiteness as a political structure globally. I think that's hugely important. In fact, I think that's where the anti-racist movement, that's the direction it needs to go in. But at the same time, I also recognise that as a writer, I'm concerned with being understood by literally everyone, somebody who is totally new to the issues as well as somebody who has been involved in the issues in 50 years. And so it puts me in in an interesting linguistic place.
The term linguistic has prompted me to remember that actually we've got lots of different constituencies in this audience tonight. I'm a political scientist, sociologist, so I'm focusing on the things that I'm interested in, but we will have many students and professors of literature here, and so I ought to ask a literary type of question about your book and writing as well. And that is, first of all, how would you define or describe the kind of book you have written? So is it a series of essays? Is it a polemic? Is it a political analysis? How would you describe it?
It's been called all of those things, not by me. So I just wanted to express myself, really. I'm claiming artistic license on this one. I just wanted to, I was an English literature student, so I learned how to put together an argument, and I wanted to try and make an overarching argument. I didn't really see each chapter as an essay. I think some people do. I didn't really consider it to be a polemic because there's quite a bit of reporting there. It's not just all first person. There's a bit of my own anecdotes in there, but it's not a memoir. I don't think, it's just a piece of non-fiction, isn't it? The only thing that I was consistent about was making sure that everything that I said in there was, every fact that I mentioned was truthful, and because of that, it's non-fiction. That's as far as I will go to define it.
Okay. One of the things that was very striking in terms of the style that you wrote in was that the person you were addressing the book to, the addressee, was somebody of colour. That's how it read. And that became very apparent in the very last bit of the book, in a way that the starkness of that hit me when you actually, for the first time, address white people. And you say, sorry, this isn't very skillful of me, but you address white people by saying, have I written it down? Can you remember what I'm saying directly? I'm sorry.
I can't remember what I wrote.
In the aftermath. This is not for you.
Well, we just know that I address white people.
Everybody's going to start thumbing through. Essentially, at some point in one of the latter chapters, you actually just say, look, white person, if you want to be included active, this is what you need to do. And it was very jolting, actually, and I suddenly realized that all the people you were addressing before were people of color. Was that a conscious thing?
This is a hotly debated question, because some people have said to me, oh, well, obviously the book's for white people. So I'm like, I don't know. It wasn't conscious. That line was, I knew that a white person was going to say, what should I do? So I was like, let me just preempt it.
Yes.
Didn't stop white people asking, but just saying, if you're going to ask that question today. I just wanted to express myself. I just wanted to do an analysis I wanted existing in the world. And sometimes readers who are not white have gone, oh yeah, this is really great. This is so affirming. This book is so affirming. And then other people have said to me, well, obviously the book's for white people. So I've decided that I don't know who it's for anymore. And that way, everyone can debate away about who the book is for, who it's addressed to. And perhaps it's ambiguous. But I've decided my stance on this is death of the author. My opinion doesn't matter on who it is addressed to, as long as it resonates with whomever the imagined reader is. And it's been a question that has plagued me since I started writing the proposal. Well, who's going to read it? I was like, honestly, I don't know. I do not know.
Everybody, it looks like. Elika is just nudging me to say we're almost out of time. Can I ask one more question, Elika? One, I promise. And it's quite an important one. We'll only just start the conversation and others might pick it up. And that is in the last chapter titled, well, it's not the chapter, it's the aftermath. it has a very optimistic tone, and you actually say, I wrote this down so I wouldn't have to hunt for it, you say, I think the side of anti-racist progress is winning. I'm filled with hope. I mean, it was a very powerful statement. Why do you think that is? What has changed? What's giving you hope?
People's bravery and willingness to speak has changed. There's been a huge democratization of who can speak and who, and there's been a surpassing of gatekeepers in a way that hasn't been anticipated before. You don't need to say this, you know, the internet, social media and all of that stuff has got its drawbacks, but it's certainly had its positives, and my book's a part of that. And, you know, I think that, I remember once, one of the interviews I did when the book came out a year ago was I did an interview, somebody was like, yes, this is a very new perspective, isn't it? It's so new, it seems so fresh, like less than 5 years old. I was like, no, it's not. Like, it's reached you in the last 5 years, but I was looking at stuff from like the 60s and 70s when researching this book, and even further back than that. So the only thing that's new is communication methods that have meant that this particular white and middle class journalist suddenly felt quite confronted by these arguments. But these were conversations that had been happening for years and years and years. And so I'm optimistic at the moment that the conversations are happening in public. And I think that's just something to do with like a little bit of a blurring of the public and private sphere, in particular when it comes to conversation in general. But now that the conversations are happening in public, it feels like, wow, things may actually progress, or at least, you know, get better. But the impact is soon to be seen. I don't want to. Maybe I was too hopeful in that section. I don't know.
Reni, thank you so much, and I'm going to hand over to Jhalak, and lots of other people will ask you questions now.
Thank you. Thank you.
We will have a chance to thank Rebecca at the end for guiding that conversation so beautifully and sensitively with Reni. But now, on that note that we just touched of widening the address, we would very much like to have some Q&A with the audience. Reni's very happy to take questions, and we'll start now. I see a question right here in the third row.
I think questioning the ways in which some things that have been considered rigid, I feel like some assumptions about what racism is and how it affects people that have been considered to be quite rigid are being really, they feel quite malleable at the moment. They feel quite flexible. Now feels like the right time to be pushing and questioning against some things that have felt, you know, almost as concrete and they're like set in stone. And I think that's the first way. And I think also having, oh God, it's going to sound so cliche, having conversations, isn't it? But it's true, having those conversations. I did an event a couple of weeks ago, and there was an interesting conversation between me and somebody who was from the older generation about the passing down of information to the younger generation. And I said that I feel like sometimes younger people of colour in Britain have to reinvent the wheel. And it's like bad information about obstacles that one might have to face is withheld from us at a time when we really need to know. And I think that like sharing that information in an age-appropriate way with, you know, people my sister's age, she's about to, you know, go into her teenage years, not just talking about the people who overcame the odds, but also the odds that they had to overcome is going to be one of the ways in which we can start having a bit more of an honest conversation about the country that we live in. But I feel like pushing back against some things that we've considered to be quite rigid is the first way. I mean, I think it's so interesting at the moment that public figures who became public figures long before these public conversations are happening are currently feeling a little under pressure to respond to them, which I think is really interesting because it means that the climate has changed, and I can only imagine that's a good thing. So just practice those questionings in your everyday lives. Obviously, pick your battles wisely, but just practice that questioning, yeah.
There's a question in the second row over here.
I'll tell you something that disturbed me recently. It was an objectively a good thing. The Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing was announced, and why I'm won the award alongside Stuart Hall's Familiar Stranger. And which is obviously an amazing thing, like wow, being compared to Stuart Hall, amazing. But one of the comments that the judges made was, the judge picked out a book from the last few centuries dealing with race, and this was supposed to be the book for the 21st century. And I thought, this is very concerning. Does that mean that we're going to have to wait another century, like, for the conversation to be back on the agenda? Is this just a small, fluke in history, and then the conversation is going to die down, and then we have to wait another 50, 60 years for somebody else to write a book? I thought that's not good. And so that really speaks to that question about keeping the door open. Recently I've been thinking about, institutions of remembrance and remembering and keeping things at the forefront of people's minds. When I was writing the first chapter of the book, a lot of the stuff that I was looking at in, the Black Cultural Archives or the British Library, it was already public information. It had just been public decades prior. And I sort of had a debate with myself, like, should I really just be re-reporting stuff that's already been reported? And I was like, but then why have I grown up not really knowing about it, even though it was reported? And so I thought, okay, it needs re-reporting for a new generation. But that shouldn't really have to be done in a commercial book. Like, that should be somewhere where everybody can access the information. You shouldn't have to pay $8.99. And then I was alerted to the fact that there's currently a petition doing the rounds about getting education about, I think it's colonialism on the national curriculum, that I would urge everyone to sign, and people who are in far more better situations than, better positions, I think, than I am to lobby their institutions, and ideally right up to the Department for Education, to look at the history that we're teaching our kids. I think that's how the door's kept open, because there's a lot of wacky things going on in the world right now, not just in the world, but in this country, and we need to have some kind of understanding of what the most recent context has been so that we can have a grasp of what's happening today. I'm trying to do it with my work. I did this podcast series that looked at recent history in the same way that the book did, but I can only do so much by myself. So, I think education is the key, but not just education in a vague way, but really targeted campaigning to make sure that information is in a place that everyone can access it.
This is probably an appropriate point at which to close the public aspect of this and move on to the book signings. I've got some very careful instructions, because we are so many. I have some careful instructions about that in a moment. But first of all, I would like us all, please, very much to thank first Rebecca Surender for guiding the conversation with Reni, as we heard. And then we very much, in the bottom of our hearts, want to thank Reni for sharing her very, very powerful thoughts with us, and for continuing this conversation about anti-racism, which is so crucial, and I think we all, in our different ways, are invested in. So thank you so much, Reni, and thank you, Rebecca.